Part 2 of what you need to know about IELTS speaking. Let's begin.
In the first part of this What You Need to Know video, I discussed the test format and the differences between parts 1, 2, and 3. I also spoke about the timings of each part. In this video, I will go into more detail regarding the timing as well as how you can generate ideas for part 3. First, let's discuss the timings. But I want you to remember that the examiner is responsible for managing the time in the speaking test. Nowhere in the band descriptors does it say you, as an IELTS candidate, are responsible for the time. So why is practicing timing so important? Well, if your answer is too long or too short, it may affect your performance, which will affect your score. How? Well, not only will you constantly be interrupted, but you may not get to your point. So your answers won't be concise, which means you may not even answer the question. You see, this is really important, especially in part 1. Why? Because in part 1, you have to answer the question directly and then expand on your answer. In part 2, you are allowed flexibility regarding the topic. For example, if the question is about cats and you don't have a cat, you're allowed to talk about pets. You won't be penalized for that. Why am I mentioning this? Because I want to highlight the differences between part 1 and 2. And I'd like to emphasize the importance of answering the question directly in part 1. If your answer is too long in part 1, chances are you will be interrupted before you get to answer the question. This may leave you feeling frustrated and it may even break your confidence, which will affect your performance for the rest of the exam. Just think about this for a second. Imagine yourself in the IELTS speaking test. You've just started part 1 and you never get to answer the question directly because you're talking too much. And by the time you get to your answer and to your point, you're interrupted. That would be a shame, because now you're thinking, oh, great, I'm doing such a bad job already. And if you have those kinds of thoughts in the exam, part 2 and part 3 will be affected. And the thing is, some may argue that part 2 and part 3 hold more weight. Why? Because you have to talk more, which means more is required of you. So to allow part 1, which is meant to be almost like an interview with short, simple answers, to affect the rest of the test is unnecessary and it can be avoided. That leads me to my next question. How can this be avoided? How can we get the timing right? How do we practice this and how do we train ourselves? Well, I'm going to give you a guideline. So for part 1, my recommendation is you speak for 20 to 25 seconds per question. This is about 2 to 3 sentences. Now, how can you train yourself to do this? Well, you get some common part 1 questions. You get your stopwatch and you practice speaking for 20 to 25 seconds. Start getting a feel for that. Start practicing getting to your point in 25 seconds. Now, the timing of each answer will vary because it's impossible to speak for exactly 25 seconds each time. And it is impossible to avoid getting interrupted by the examiner. In fact, you should expect interruptions. They are a normal part of the IELTS speaking test. If you get interrupted, which you will, it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. and it doesn't mean you will lose any marks. However, you need to train yourself to be concise so that you can answer the question directly, as I've mentioned a few times in this video already. At the same time, you need to train yourself to give answers that are well developed and avoid answers that are too short, because the examiner won't be able to properly assess your fluency, grammar, pronunciation, or vocabulary if you don't speak enough. So let's move on to part 2. By now you know you should aim to speak for 2 minutes. How do you know if you've spoken for 2 minutes? Well, the examiner will interrupt you at the 2-minute mark. When this happens, don't try and finish your answer. You are not required to finish your answers. Nowhere in the band descriptors does it say the student was able to finish their answer. In fact, it may be slightly disrespectful if you insist on finishing your answer, because the examiner has a job to do and they have to stick to that time limit. It's part of their job requirement. It's nothing personal. So how do you practice your timing for part 2? Well, you do the same thing as part 1. You get your stopwatch, you get some cue cards with common part 2 questions, and you start to train yourself to speak for 2 minutes. The more you do this, the more you will get a feel for what 2 minutes feels like. Lastly, part 3. How can you practice your timing, and how long should your answers be? Well, for part 3, I recommend 30 to 40 seconds per question, because this is a discussion. Now, once again, it's not a discussion where you get to ask the examiner questions, but it is supposed to feel like a discussion. So the examiner will ask you follow-up questions. And this is not straightforward. These questions are abstract. And so that requires you to speak for longer than part 1. So 30 to 40 seconds is a good recommendation. Now, how do you train yourself to speak for this long? You do the same thing as part 1 and part 2. You get common part 3 questions and you get your stopwatch out and you time yourself for 30 seconds. What does 30 seconds feel like? What does 40 seconds feel like? So practice and train yourself like an athlete would train themselves. Practice every single day so that you can really get comfortable with how long you should speak for. And once again, I want to say that even when you do this, it doesn't mean you won't be interrupted in the exam. You will be interrupted in the exam, and it's okay. It will have no effect on your score. So be prepared for the interruptions, expect them, know that it's a normal part of the test, but practice these timings and train yourself so that you are able to answer the questions in a way that's effective and in a way that helps you score high. Now, let's move on to the second part of this video. Staying on the topic of part 3, the most common question I get from students is, what if I don't know what to say for part 3? How can I generate ideas? And they ask me this because, as I've mentioned many times, part 3 is about abstract ideas, it's about general ideas, it's about society as a whole. So how can you generate more complex ideas? Well, you need to research them. How can you research ideas? Well, you study social issues. What is going on in society right now? What is being discussed in the news? What are some trending topics? What are people talking about on social media? There are many ways to do this. You can read the BBC, The Guardian. There's a great website called The Big Think with so many different topics, and it does relate to what is happening in the world right now. The resources are endless. In our course, we actually give you resources that you can use to research these ideas. Now, you don't have to study ideas and study social issues for hours and hours a day. You can just make it a part of your daily routine. Keeping up with what's happening and what people are talking about is an easy thing to do if you just make it part of your life. If you use social media, then use it and be aware of what people are saying. If you like watching YouTube, then what are some trending videos right now? If you like reading articles, what are the trending articles? What are the big things happening? What are the things that people are speaking about that may have a big impact on this world? What are the small things that are happening? How are families being affected? How is society being affected by the different changes that we're going through? It doesn't have to be as complicated as it sounds. It really just is keeping up with what's going on in the world and finding a way that works for you. So whether, like I said, that's social media or articles or websites like Big Think, find a way to keep up to date, because that will help you on the day of your exam. Let me know in the comments, what are some of your favorite ways to keep up to date with what's going on in the world right now? And if you do start training yourself according to what I've just given you regarding the timings of the IELTS speaking exam, then let me know how it goes. I want to know about your progress. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please like and share and follow for more. I will see you in the next one.